Today, we're talking about one of the most important financial aspects of a contract of sale here in the Lowcountry. That's earnest money. How much should it be? Who gets the money? What happens if the contract falls apart? So let's get after it. All right, guys, today we're breaking down another component of the local contractor sale just to make sure that our buyers and sellers are super educated about every aspect of the contract. And this is one that we feel like people probably just kind of go along with. They sort of assume that everything is the way it's supposed to be, but I don't think they really break it down. And that has to do with the escrow deposit or the earnest money of the contract. That amount of money that you're writing at the time that the contract comes to fruition that kind of hangs out in this account. Well, whose account is that? How much money is it? Who does it go to? What happens if the contract falls apart? But we just kind of want to break that down a little bit. So, Chris, let's just kind of get after it. Let's talk about maybe let's talk about timing. The house is on the market. Buyer comes along. They love the house. They want to write an offer. They're sitting down with their agent. They're going to go through that. They're going through the local contract. They said, okay, well, how much do you want to offer on the house?
Sure.
Okay, I want to offer X, Y, Z. Great. Well, how much do you want the deposit to be? And that's like this pause point. So let's talk about like the timing of that. Like we either talk about how much that is or the timing. You pick which one of those you want to go after.
Well, timing is typically right when you're writing the contract up. And it's not a predetermined amount. It's not a set amount that it has to be. It could be a variable amount, whatever the buyer really wants to present to the seller.
Right.
But it tends to happen initially. It's kind of that initial offering to the seller. Here are my terms. Here's some earnest money to tie me financially to the contract that I'm presenting to you. And it could be a large sum of money. It could be a moderate sum of money. It could be a very small sum of money. And a seller's going to kind of look at that and say, okay, where does that fall in?
And what do they think about that, right? It's like, because they're trying to figure out, it's like, okay, well, it's a negotiable amount. And I was thinking, you know, you and I have been at this for a long time. I go back to early Hilton Head days, okay? Well, this was when people had checkbooks and they weren't wiring money or anything like that. And so they'd be here on vacation and they'd sit down with their real estate agent. The real estate agent would say, listen, the standard is 10% of the purchase price is going to be the escrow amount or the earnest money. Okay, great. But I don't have 10% of that amount in my checking account. I mean, that checking account I'm using to write for pizzas and groceries and all that kind of stuff. So it used to be that the modality was sort of a two-phase component. They'd write a check for $1,000 and then by the time they got home, maybe like 10 days later, they would mail the balance of 10% of that purchase price back down to the real estate agent and have it go into the escrow.
Yeah, a lot of times what we're seeing now is the contract will say earnest money of X amount will be provided within 3 days, or 2 days, or something like that. And typically, instead of a handwritten check now, it's just going to be a wire to the person that's holding the amount, which is another thing that a lot of people don't understand. Who's holding the money?
Who's that go to? So it used to, let's go back in those days, and really up until honestly, maybe like 10 years ago or so, it was always went to the listing agency. So whoever had the listing, that firm had an escrow account, and that's where that check would get written to, and they would hold that money without any bias until the transaction was about to close, and they would send that money over to the closing attorney, because it would basically, like you always say, it's not additional money, it's used towards the purchase price.
Yeah, now what we're seeing more of is the purchaser's closing attorney. So in real estate transactions in South Carolina, the purchaser hires an attorney, a closing attorney, and the seller hires a closing attorney. So the purchaser might say, within 3 days, I'm gonna wire $10,000 and it's gonna be held in my attorney's escrow account, which is an account that's dedicated for this type of funds. It's not an account that attorney can use, or it's got to sit there. It might be an interest bearing or non-interest bearing. That's sometimes specified, but that's where it stays. And I think one thing that we need to talk about too is this thing of wire fraud, because wire fraud is real, and there's a lot of ways people can kind of get down the wrong pathway. So why don't you talk a little bit about how to protect yourself against wire fraud in this initial part of the contract?
Yeah, well, wire fraud is real, and I think everybody in real estate and all the attorneys seem to have this huge disclaimer, paragraph at the bottom of their emails, like never wire money without verifying to the party that you intend to send the money, what the account information is, etc. Usually on the telephone. In other words, because it can also be like an email thread could be hijacked and say, and all of a sudden the numbers are changed and if you're watching this and you've heard of someone having that horrific story, it does happen. It's not common, but it can happen certainly nationally and internationally. So you always want to make sure that you are verifying when you're sending that wire over, no matter whether it's for real estate or anything else, verifying with the entity that you intend to send it to on the phone in a trusted manner, the information that you need to be
very
sending
important.
it to.
Yeah.
Now let me go back to a little bit about like who holds that money. So now it's the purchaser's attorney. There's two points on that. One is all the money ultimately needs to pool into that account anyway. So it sort of saves a step. When it used to go to the listing agency or maybe the buyer agency, and then prior to closing, the buyer's attorney would say, hey, wire or send that money over to us. We need it. This removes that additional maybe exposure component. And the second part is sellers don't need to worry about that. They're like, wait, I want it with my attorney. It's like, no, guys, these are escrow accounts.
Doesn't matter.
They're governed by law in the state of South Carolina, all under the same laws. They are unbiased. And the dictation of the money when it gets there, no matter who has that escrow account, is the disposition of the money is that it belongs to the contract of sale, which is kind of a funny thing to say, like it belongs to the 7-page contract. Well, kind of. It sits in this escrow account and no longer belongs to the buyer because they've sent it from their account. It doesn't belong to the seller because they don't have it in their account. And it doesn't belong to the account owner, like the purchaser's attorney, because they're just holding it as escrow. It belongs to the contract of sale, and that dictates what happens to the money. So let's talk a little bit about like the disposition of earnest money, Chris. Like in some situations, it's really categorically clear that if there's a problem with the contract, it goes back to the buyer. What are those situations?
So there's certain areas, and we've talked about a few of them in prior videos, but like financing or something like that, the contract might say that the buyer has the right to obtain financing, the buyer has a right to X or whatever it is. And if that contingency isn't satisfied and it's done so in a timely manner according to the contract, then it's the understanding that the earnest money can get released.
Back to the buyer.
But the release of earnest money has to be a mutual decision between the buyer and the seller. They both have to agree that, yes, this is not going to happen and the money is going to be released. The money can be released in part. The buyer and seller can say, hey, a situation happened. We're really kind of beyond our control. We understand there's kind of damages on both sides. We agree to maybe split it. Or something that can happen. So things like that. The other thing that can happen is a buyer might submit an offer and they specify that there is a contingency, but they also go on to specify in the event that this happens or doesn't happen, that the buyer and seller already agree to release the earnest money within X amount of days or immediately. And so that's an important part too that can be added to a contract.
Yeah, so that would be something like, hey, listen, we're going to buy the house, but it's contingent on us coming down to see it. And if we don't like it, we're not going to buy it, and we're not going to give up our earnest money in that. So language would be contingent upon satisfactory inspection. Purchaser has the right to cancel the contract and get their earnest money back. That would be something like that.
Sure.
But there are some situations, and you brought this up, where you get through those contingencies. And guys, like life, real estate's about life, and life does happen. Sometimes you just get a situation where maybe someone last minute, they lost their job. Maybe there was a health situation. Maybe there's a family situation. All of a sudden, a buyer maybe just says, I can't go through with this. That's where you get in that gray, because basically the language of the contract doesn't dictate that the buyer gets the money back, and it doesn't dictate that the seller automatically gets the money. It basically says the parties have got to come to an agreement, like you said, a written release, and until that release is signed by both parties, that money is sitting in that escrow account until it's resolved.
Yeah, and that written release, if it doesn't happen between the buyer and seller, then it escalates. That's when the attorneys and courts need to get involved to come to a resolution.
And we normally don't see that happen. You know, we're
Very
typically
rare.
dealing with
Yeah.
people that understand life happens and nobody wants to have a deal fall apart, right? The money is there at risk from the purchaser, but the seller needs to know it doesn't automatically revert to them and say, wait a
Right.
minute, I thought when they canceled, I get the money. No, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but maybe better said, it's a little bit more reasonable than that. The money's put at risk. The buyer doesn't get it. You don't get it. You guys better come to terms and try to figure it out. So let's go back now to the amount I talked about
Sure.
a long time ago. It was standard was 10%. And I can say that once the market shifted in that big shift, '08 or '09 or so,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've ever seen anything change so fast from 10% down to 5%. It was like, man, buyers are like, all right, I'm only putting down 5%. And now, and that's been a long time.
Yeah.
It seems like it's kind of all over the board.
It is all over the board. And working with sellers specifically, it's interesting that they pick up on it.
Mm-hmm.
They pick up on, hey, here's a offer. I'm looking at, they're only putting $1,000 down. This is $1 million property. That seems a little light. So it really does resonate with the seller. It shows kind of where the buyer is. If a buyer's putting a cash offer together for $1 million property and is going to put a $1,000 earnest money check with it, the seller's going to scratch their head a little bit.
That one doesn't make sense.
We saw a lot of this take place when you had multiple offer scenarios. Maybe you had two offers that were real tight on terms and price, but maybe one buyer offered more earnest money. Well, that doesn't really translate into a better deal for the seller, but what it does translate into is the seller goes, gosh, they seem more serious. So it's a posturing maneuver.
For a buyer, it could be a negotiating tactic.
Of course.
You want to make a strong offer, then put down a bunch of money, right? You, as long as you understand the disposition of that money, to your point, a seller might say, wow, maybe it's a 10% deposit. Like, wow, that's a lot of money in today's standard.
I think if you flip the script too, the seller should focus on what's most important of the contract. I think earnest money is not one of the most important elements of the contract, okay? It's a part of the contract.
Right.
It's an element of discussion. It's an element of negotiating. But if a seller's hyper-focused on that, you don't want to win that battle but lose the war.
Right.
So leave a smaller amount of earnest money, that's fine. Maybe let's just get the contract price where it needs to be.
Same thing can be said for buyers too. Like it's a negotiable factor. So decide which ones are most important. You know, if all of a sudden you find a seller who says that seems like a low earnest money, I like everything else, but it's low earnest money, and you can get the house at that offer price, then bring up your earnest money if you're comfortable with it. It's a moving part.
And it's not an extra payment. Let's just make that clear. It's not an extra payment. It's part of the price.
It goes towards the purchase price.
It goes towards the purchase price.
And listen, when people enter into contracts to sale, it's almost always in good faith, right? They want it to close. So to your point is the intention is for that money to be part of the purchase price at closing, which is why it's already going to the purchaser's attorney, right?
Sure.
Get ready for that to happen. All right, guys, that's a little bit on earnest money. And as always, guys, we really appreciate your time, attention to the topics we're covering, and we'll talk to you all soon.